I've made a few videos on camera borders in the past, but this week I want to cater to the people who want something a little bit cleaner. The people who enjoy the simpler things in life. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make an animated gradient camera border for your live stream in Blender 3D using a method that I think is pretty cool. And side note, the real takeaway here is the method. You can use it for all sorts of things, not just camera borders or gradients. All you have to do is download Blender, link in the description, and follow along. I've also uploaded my example file to the Discord, link also in the description, with a few extra examples included. And if you like these kinds of tutorials, the absolute best way to say thank you, kind Blender wizard, for saving me from hours of frustration is to hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell. It costs you literally nothing, and it keeps me alive.
I feed on YouTube subscriptions. Without them I will perish.
That being said, let's make you a cool new camera border. My name is Chris Folea. I'm your stream scholar. Welcome to StreamSchool. Alright, first things first, let's go ahead and get our Blender file set up to actually make a camera border. So in Blender, go ahead and click off of the splash screen. Then you want to come all the way over here to the right and click on the camera button. Then you want to come all the way down here to where it says film and click on it to expand it. And here you want to click the transparent checkbox. That'll make sure that your camera border has a nice transparent background rather than an ugly solid gray background. Then you want to scroll down to where it says color management and click on that to expand it. You might have to scroll down with your middle mouse wheel here a little bit, but here where it says view transform, you want to change that from filmic to standard. That'll make sure that your camera border has nice vibrant colors rather than dull flat colors that would normally be intended to be color graded later. Next, you want to go up here to the printer icon. And here you want to change the frame rate from 24 frames per second to 60 frames per second, or whatever you're streaming at, but 60 is pretty standard. Then over in the 3D viewport, you want to take your mouse and move it all the way down to the lower left-hand corner until it becomes a crosshair. Here you want to click and drag to split the screen into two. Then you want to do the exact same thing, but drag up to split it into two vertically. So here we have three beautiful 3D viewports. So we're going to use the top left one as our rendered preview to actually see our camera border as we're working on it. So let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit and make it prettier to look at. So I'm going to hit T on my keyboard to get rid of the toolbar. Then I'm going to click the little bow and arrow icon here to get rid of all of this unnecessary nonsense. Then finally, I'm going to click the two circle chain link icon right here, and that'll hide the grid, the camera, the light, basically anything that's just not going to be rendered in the final output. Finally, you want to go to View, Cameras, Active Camera. That'll put us through the camera view that's actually going to be rendered out. And you'll notice the camera window is a little bit small. You can zoom in on that with the middle mouse wheel just to take better advantage of the space if you want to. Then for the lower left-hand corner, we're going to use this panel as our shader editor to actually make the gradient material in a little bit. So go ahead and go up to this button in the corner and click on it. Then you want to click on Shader Editor. And here it'll come up with a really intimidating looking grid, but I promise it's not that scary, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Finally, over here in the 3D view, you want to click on the cube, make sure it's selected, it's highlighted orange, then hit delete. Then you want to click on the light and delete that. Then you want to click on the camera and hit Alt-R to reset its rotation and Alt-G to reset its location. Now we want to add the object that will eventually become our camera border. So I'm going to go up to the Add menu right here, and I'm going to click on Mesh, Plane. You'll notice we get a nice little square, so I'm going to go to View, Viewpoint, Top, and that'll give us a much nicer bird's eye top-down view of the square we just created. You can zoom in with the middle mouse wheel, and you'll notice really fast that this is a perfect square. All of the sides are the same length. Most cameras these days are a 16:9 aspect ratio, which would be 1920 by 1080 or 1280 by 720 usually. So to change this square or our camera border to a 16:9 aspect ratio, you want to hit N on your keyboard, as in no. and that'll bring up your transform settings for the plane that we just created. And you'll notice that it is 2 meters by 2 meters. Now, we could very easily make this 16 by 9 meters, but then it would be a little bit big to work with. So we're gonna keep it at 2 meters wide and click on the Y box and set that to 1.125. That'll make it a perfect 16 by 9 rectangle. And finally here, you'll notice that we have a scale and we have the dimensions of the object. Right now, because the y-axis is 0.563, that means this object is technically squished, so these are not the native dimensions of the object. So to set these as the native dimensions of the object, we need to apply the scale. Otherwise, we're gonna get some weird results later. So to do that, you just have to hit Control-A on your keyboard, and that'll bring up the Apply menu. Then you just wanna click on Scale. So now you'll notice the dimensions didn't change at all, but now they are the native scale of our object. As you can see, we have 1 by 1 by 1. It's no longer squished. So at this point, you'll notice that our rectangle is not in the camera frame, and that's because our camera is below our plane here. So it would be really easy to click on the camera, grab the movement widget, and move it up to put the rectangle into view. But then it's going to be really difficult to line this up absolutely perfectly with the edges of the camera. Fortunately, there's a really neat trick for this. So I can go to View, Viewpoint Top to put us back in our bird's eye perspective. Then I can click on the plane and go to View, Align View, Align Active Camera to Selected. And as soon as I click this, you'll notice now our camera border matches up absolutely perfectly with the camera, which is great. At this point, we're ready to get started making our wonderful gradient material. So in the rendered preview area, we need to turn this into an actual rendered preview. To do that, just come up here to the shiny circle button, and click it, and that will give us a nice rendered preview so we can actually see our camera border as a gradient as we're working on it. So now you'll also notice that our rectangle here is a pretty boring, dull gray. So to fix that, we want to go down to the material editor. We want to click on the new button, and where it says surface principled, you want to click principled and change that to emission. The difference here is that a principled shader, it has shading and lighting and it has reflections built into it. All of the stuff you would want on a 3D object. An emission shader just generates a solid color or whatever texture you feed it. No additional lighting or shading data included, which is exactly what we want for a 2D camera border. So then we're gonna come over to the shader editor over here, and I'm gonna hit N on my keyboard to hide the sidebar and give us more space. But how you navigate over here is by clicking and holding the middle mouse wheel. You can pan around. Then to zoom in, you can just scroll the middle mouse wheel like so. And how the material editor works is it goes from left to right, kind of like a comic book, or I guess a regular book for that matter. But you'll notice the emission material or node is plugged in to the material output, which generates this emission material right here. So to make this a gradient, we need to add some additional nodes that also read from left to right. So I'm gonna click and hold my middle mouse wheel to pan over to give us some space. I'm gonna go to the add menu, going to go to texture and gradient texture right here. Well, I lost it there for a second. As soon as you click that, it'll come in attached to your mouse. All you have to do is click to set it down on the graph. Then you'll notice right now on our gradient texture box, we have a color output. On our emission shader box, we have a color input. So we can plug by clicking and dragging the color to the color. And as soon as I release my mouse, now you'll notice we have this awesome gradient on our rectangle, which is not really a camera border yet. But you'll notice there's no easy way to manipulate this gradient. We don't have a way to change the color or its position or its rotation. So for that, we need to add some additional nodes. So I'm gonna pan all the way over here to give us some more space, go to add, input, texture coordinates. And this looks really confusing. It has a lot of text on it, but all of these are just different options for how a texture is mapped to a geometric surface. So we want to use the object coordinate. So I'm going to plug this blue object coordinate node into the vector of our gradient texture. And as soon as I release my mouse, you're going to notice the gradient looks a whole lot uglier. That's because this is using the object's coordinate space. So this is the center or 0 point of the object. So that's where the 0 point of the gradient is going to be, which is the beginning of the gradient. So to manipulate this, you could add a separate node and manipulate it with numbers and sliders and stuff, but that's really tedious and difficult to animate. So instead, we're going to use another object to control this gradient. And if you take even one thing away from this video, this is it. This right here is the entire purpose of this video. I wanted to make a video on how to use object-based texture coordinates in Blender. I just didn't think anybody would click on that as a video title, so I decided to make it relevant to streaming with a cool camera border. But here, this is the one thing I want you to learn. I'm going to come over here and click on Add in the 3D viewport, go to Empty, and I'm going to personally add a sphere. But all of these are exactly the same thing. The only difference is their representation in 3D space. None of these will affect the final render in any way, shape, or form. So I'm going to choose Sphere, and you'll notice our nodes disappear. That's because our camera border is no longer selected. So I'm going to click on the camera border, and here under our texture coordinate node that we created, you'll notice we have an object dialog right here, and we have an eyedropper. So if I click on the eyedropper and hover it over objects, it says plane, it says camera. We want to hover over the empty and click on it to select it. So now you'll notice that the object dialog is filled with our sphere empty, and nothing has visually changed on the gradient. But what's really cool now is this gradient is being controlled by our empty object. So if I select the empty and hit G to grab it and move it around, you'll notice that changes the position of the gradient. If I right click to undo that and hit R to rotate it, now that manipulates the rotation of the gradient. I'm gonna right click to undo that, and S manipulates the scale of the gradient, which is really cool. And I want to take a second here to talk about the power of this. So I'm going to click on my camera border, and you don't have to follow along for this part, but the really cool thing about this is it doesn't have to be a gradient texture. You can use another object to control any kind of texture. So for example, I could add a texture, noise texture, and plug this into our emission and plug the object coordinates into it. And now the noise is being controlled by this empty. And since these are 3D textures, I could move this up and down to get sort of like a cool evolving clouds or dust kind of effect. You can also scale it up and down. Or it doesn't have to be a noise texture either. If I delete the noise and add a nice image texture, for instance, I think my logo would be pretty convenient, and plug the object coordinates into that, maybe make it clip instead of repeat, and then plug that into my emission. Now we have the empty controlling my logo, which is really cool. You can change the rotation of it, you can change the position of it, you can change the scale of it. And it's all really cool, and it's all really easy and intuitive to control. I actually use this a lot when I create templates for you all to make it easy to move logos and graphics around on the templates. But I just wanted to illustrate the power there for a second, but let's get back to working on our overlay. I'm gonna undo all of that stuff. Going to delete my image node, and I'm going to plug the gradient texture in. You will notice we have one more issue with this gradient texture before I move on, and if I click the little 2 circle chain links right here and select my sphere, you'll notice that the gradient starts at the center of my sphere empty. And ideally, I want the gradient to be centered on my empty. So to fix that, we're going to add one more node to this shader graph. So I'm going to go to Add, Vector Mapping, and that'll bring in a really confusing looking node. But you'll notice as soon as I highlight over this line right here, it'll turn white. As soon as it's highlighted white, if I click, that means that this will snap into place and automatically get connected between the two, which is really convenient. So to offset the gradient by half, I'm just going to go to where it says location X. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to type 0.5 and hit enter. So now the gradient is perfectly centered on our empty. So if I scale the empty down, you can see that. It doesn't look necessarily perfectly centered because the end of the gradient is blown out white. Just trust me, it is centered. So now that we have that set up, we are ready to turn this rectangle into an actual camera border. So to do that, you want to select the rectangle, go to edit mode by clicking the drop down up here and clicking edit mode. Then we want to go to face select, which is the third button on the right next to edit mode. So then you want to select your rectangle, make sure your mouse is outside of the rectangle, and hit I on your keyboard to inset. As you move your mouse in, you can make this as thick or thin as you want. So I'm gonna make my camera border relatively thin, maybe somewhere around there. And as soon as you click to set it down, you'll notice this little pop-up comes up. You can modify the thickness of your overlay as long as you don't change anything else. The second you move or touch anything else, this pop-up will go away and you won't be able to change it anymore. So make sure you get the thickness to something that you like. I'm gonna do 0.035. I think works pretty well for me. Gonna collapse that, and then I'm going to hit delete faces to delete the face we just created, and that leaves us with a beautiful camera border. And at this point, I'm going to go back up to the drop down and go back to object mode. And here, I'm going to go ahead and click the 2-circle chain link icon to hide all of the outline and the grid and everything unnecessary. We want this view just to be a nice rendered preview of our camera border. So at this point, we have a nice black and white gradient going across our camera border, and we have a really cool way of controlling it with this sphere. So I don't want my camera border to be a black and white gradient. What I'm picturing for this camera border is a really cool sort of like reflection that sweeps across it, kind of like a coin in Mario, but I want it to be colored. So maybe it's like a lightsaber where the actual reflection is like a bright white and then it fades out to a color. So let's make that. So I'm gonna go over to where it says between gradient texture and emission. I'm gonna go to add converter color ramp. And I'm gonna snap this right between gradient texture and emission, just like that. So the color ramp node is very similar to a gradient map in Photoshop, if you're familiar with that at all. So if this was an image, for instance, all of the shadows would be mapped to this end of the gradient, and all of the highlights would be mapped to this end of the gradient, and everything in between would be in between. But since we have a black and white gradient, this is pretty much a one-to-one representation. What I mean by that is if I take this centerpiece and drag it to move it, or you can use the position slider right here. I'm gonna set it to the exact center. Then I click the plus button to add another point. I can drag this over to the other end, click on the color box and make it solid black. Now we have a nice little light beam right here. So it sort of starts out black, then fades to white, and then fades to black again. However, you're gonna notice that the gradient starts here and ends here. So we have like I guess about half of our camera border that we don't really have any control over currently. So we want to scale this gradient up so we have the entire camera border to work within. So I'm going to select the sphere, hit S on my keyboard, and scale this up until it looks about right to where the black is just at the edge of the camera border. And now we have this entire area to work with for our gradient. So I'm going to click on the camera border. And again, what I'm picturing is like a bright white core and then it fades out to color. And for that, we probably want this gradient to be a lot less harsh. We want it to be smoother. This has a pretty harsh fall off. So there are different interpolation modes for the color ramp that you can use to do this. And this is set to linear currently, but if you hit the drop down and click on B-spline, you'll notice we get a much more appealing, gradual, smooth fall off. And to approach the color fall off, you might think we need to add additional points. That would be the intuitive way to do it. There's actually a neat trick in Blender. In Blender, you can have colors that are brighter than white. So if I select the center point here, click on the box and set the value to 3, that is now 3 times brighter than white. So now if I saturate that, maybe 0.615 for saturation, just right off the top of my head, no experimentation. You'll notice that it starts out bright white in the center and it fades out to a color, kind of like a lightsaber, which looks really cool. I'm personally gonna change the hue of mine to make it more pink like the StreamScholar YouTube channel. but you can experiment and do whatever you want. And you're not even limited to doing the kind of overlay that I'm doing. You have complete creative control here. You can add as many points and colors to this gradient as you want. You could create different kinds of animations from what we create here today. Experiment with it. I want to encourage you to have fun and come up with your own cool thing. And I've also, by the way, uploaded my example file with a few extra examples to the Discord, just to give you all some ideas. But now that we have this set up, and this is pretty wide for a shine that goes across the overlay, so now that I have this gradient set up the way I want, I feel comfortable scaling my sphere back down, back to where I want it, because I have the gradient set up how I want it now. So I'm thinking maybe somewhere about that big for our reflection that goes across the overlay. I'm gonna click to set that, and what I'm picturing is I'm gonna go ahead and rotate this, because we're ready to animate this camera border now. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate the sphere by going up to my transform panel. Again, if that's not showing, you can hit N on your keyboard to show it, as in no. I'm going to go to the Z rotation, click on it, and set that to -45. And what I'm picturing here is I want this to sort of start on the left and sweep across like this. I think that makes for a really cool animated camera border design. So to animate this, I'm going to click on the movement widget, which if your movement widget is not out, you can access that right here. But I'm gonna go ahead and click on the movement widget and move it all the way over to the left until the camera border is completely solid black. Then I'm gonna go up to where it says location. I'm gonna hover my mouse over any one of the boxes and hit I on my keyboard. That'll turn all of the locations yellow. That means we have applied that location for this point in time on this frame, and it is ready to be animated. So now we want to go ahead to the future in our timeline and animate it sweeping across. So I think a cool sweep across this camera border should take about 5 seconds. I think that would look pretty good. Unfortunately, Blender starts you out with a file that is only 250 frames long, which is less than 5 seconds at 60 frames per second. To do the math, 60 frames per second times 5 seconds is 300 frames. So we need to make our document longer. So we can go down to the corner here where it says end. I can click on it and I can change that to, let's do 350. That'll give us 5 seconds to sweep across and then a little bit less than a second to pause before it does it again. So now I can zoom out of the timeline like so until we can see the entire extent of our animation. Then we want to go over to frame 300. So to do that, we can go to this little box right here that says 1 and click on it and type 300, hit enter. And now you'll notice that the location box is turned green. That means that nothing has changed on this frame, but there's also no keyframe set. So if we zoom out a little bit and grab our sphere and move it all the way across like so, until it's completely black again. Now you'll notice that the X box turned orange, and that means that something has changed, the value has changed, but we have not set a keyframe yet. So if we go to a different frame right now, this will snap all the way back over to the left because we don't have a keyframe set on this frame. So I'm gonna hover over this box again, hit I on my keyboard to make it yellow, and now if we hit space, you'll notice that it sweeps across the camera border like so, pauses for a little bit less than a second, and then it sweeps again. But with the animation, we have one more problem that we need to solve. You'll notice that this sphere sort of speeds up and then slows down, and it's fastest in the center, slowest towards the edges. Now, personally, I think this would look better if it just went one consistent speed. So the reason Blender does this is because by default, it sets all animations to a Bezier interpolation, which is related to the graph editor. So if you're interested in learning more about the finer details of animating in Blender and using the graph editor, I actually have an entire video on that. But for the sake of this tutorial, all you need to know is that we want this animation to be a linear interpolation. So I'm going to click off of these frames so they're not yellow anymore. Click on one frame, right click it, go to interpolation mode linear. Then I'm going to select the other frame, right click it, go to interpolation mode linear. So now if we hit play, you'll notice that the sphere goes one consistent speed across, and it doesn't matter that we don't see it ease to a stop because it's not going to be visible in our final camera border. But then it pauses for a little bit less than a second and it sweeps across again, which is exactly what we want. So at this point, we have a cool shine going across our camera border, and I think that looks pretty cool. The animation is basically done. But I know a lot of you are probably thinking, yeah, but I don't want my camera border to be solid black. I want like another gradient behind the animated reflection. And that's a little bit more complicated, but let's do it. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on the camera border, zoom all the way out so we can see all of the nodes. I'm going to click and drag to select everything up to the color ramp, including the color ramp. I'm gonna hit Shift D to duplicate them on my keyboard, and I'm gonna set them down right here by clicking. So right here, we have an exact replica, an exact duplicate of this reflection animation that goes across our camera border. But because it's not connected, this is in no way, shape, form, or fashion affecting our material or camera border at all. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So we're going to change the gradient currently. We're gonna save the shine over here, then we're gonna change the currently attached gradient to be a nice background gradient. So to start, I'm gonna go to our texture coordinate node, hit the X next to empty to undo that. So now the animation is no longer controlling our gradient. I'm gonna go ahead and make another empty to make controlling this gradient easy. So I'll go to add, empty, cube. And the reason I'm choosing a cube is just to differentiate from the sphere. Again, you can choose any empty that you want. Then I'm going to select the camera border, select the eyedropper, and select the cube. So now this gradient is being controlled by the cube. So if I select the camera border again, let's go ahead and modify this gradient to be a nice two-tone background gradient. So I'm going to select the middle point and delete it since it's really bright and it's going to be a little more difficult to work with. Then I'm going to move these 2 points further out, and let's say I want this to be like a nice dark pink purple, and then maybe a more dark bluish purple. And again, you have complete creative freedom here. You can add as many points as you want. So if I want to make this even more blue and dark towards the end of the gradient, and even more pink towards that end of the gradient, I have complete control over that. And I think that looks pretty cool. So this will be our background gradient. And now I'm just gonna select my cube. I'm gonna go to the rotation and set it to 90 degrees to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise. And it's a little bit harsh, so I'm gonna hit S on my keyboard to scale it up to make it a little bit more of a subtle gradient like so. And I think that looks pretty cool. So now if we hit play, you'll notice that the shine animation is not playing across our camera border. And that's because that gradient is not connected. So let's go ahead and fix that as well. So if I click on the camera border, and I'm going to select the emission and material output and move those out of the way for now, we have a node that is designed to mix two colors. So if I go to add, color, mix RGB, and slam that down right here, this lets you mix two colors, textures, images, honestly whatever you want, by a factor. So for instance, if I take my background gradient and plug that into slot 1, it's a little bit confusing because background is slot 1, foreground is slot 2. You would think the foreground would be on top. But anyway, I'm gonna take the shine and plug that into slot 2. Then I'm gonna take the mix and plug that into our emission node. And immediately you'll notice we have the shine going across, but it looks pretty dull. And that's because we're using the mix mode on this node. So this just literally fades between two separate colors or textures. Or you can use a black and white image if you want to make a mask, but that's not quite what we want. See, if we fade to 0, we get the background. If we fade to 1, we get the shine. What we want instead is to add these two colors together so that the pink would add to the purple, the white would add to the purple, and it would just, that they would both be mixed together properly. So to do that, I'm going to go to the mix node, click the drop down and select add. And now you'll notice immediately, as long as this is set to 1, we're adding these together by a factor of 1. And now we have our gradient backdrop with our beautiful shine sweeping straight on through. At this point, all that's left to do is export this into a transparent WebM file. And to do that is also pretty easy to do. So you can go all the way over to the right to the printer icon. And First things first, you're gonna notice that the resolution is probably a little bit big for a camera border. This is 1920 by 1080. That is a higher resolution than most people even stream at. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this to 50% of 1920 by 1080. You could manually adjust these numbers, but that's a little bit tedious. Then I'm gonna come down to the output settings and I'm gonna change the file format from PNG to FFmpeg video. And you'll notice we only have an option for black and white or red, green, blue. We don't have an option for red, green, blue, alpha, which would give us transparency. So to change that, we need to go down to encoding. We want to change the container to WebM, that's the file type. Then we want to change the codec to WebM/VP9. And here you'll notice that gives us the third option for red, green, blue, alpha. You want to make sure that is selected. And then to output this, let's choose a location by going to the folder right here, clicking the folder, and just choose on your hard drive wherever you want this video file to end up. I'm gonna go to this project folder personally, and I'm gonna call this Chris Overlay.webm, hit enter, then hit accept. And this video file does not exist yet. The software actually has to go through and calculate each frame of the video to create the WebM file. This folder right here is just where it's going to save that once the software has done that process. So to actually do that process, you have to go up here to the left, click on render, and click render animation. And as soon as you click that, you're gonna get a nice little window that pops up and the entire animation is gonna play through from 0 all the way to 350. And as soon as this is done playing through, calculating all of the frames, and no sooner, then you will have a transparent WebM file in this location that you can pop into OBS. Now over in OBS, adding the camera border is super easy to do. All you have to do is come down here to the plus icon and click it, go to media source, and at this point you can name it whatever you want. I'm gonna call this Chris Overlay, yeah. Then I'm gonna hit OK. That'll bring up this dialog right here. You want to browse and find wherever you saved your WebM file. So I'm going to double click chrisoverlay.webm. And here you want to make sure you check the loop checkbox. If you don't, as soon as it plays through, it's gonna disappear. So I'm gonna click the loop checkbox, hit OK, and now we have our animated camera border that we can adjust to put around our camera like so. I think that looks pretty cool, but that is pretty much all there is to it. Hopefully at this point you have a cool new camera border to use on your live stream, and more importantly, hopefully you also have a solid understanding of how to use object-based texture coordinates in Blender 3D. I just Miyagi'd your ass. If you found this video useful, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button below the video and ring the bell for new content almost every single week. And if you want to come hang out during one of my live streams, you can catch me over at youtube.com/oraclefish at least every Friday. Until next time, my name is Chris Folea, I'm your stream scholar, and class is out.